Welcome back to Sputnik. The world is awash with refugees fleeing the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, poverty and disease.
The unluckiest take to the high seas in rusting, leaking boats. Others fan out across a Europe already buckling under its own economic woes. Some thousands actually, camp out in Calais hoping to hitch a ride on a wagon or a train bound for Britain.
It's all manna from heaven, of course, for right-wing politicians and media outlets, and europhobes who get the chance to kick the French as well. Joining us now is one of the few British-based journalists trying to put all this in context. Nabila Ramdani. Nabila, welcome to the show. You're following this story closely, being half French and also from North Africa in origin. So you have as it were, a double handle on this. Here's my take, that the British media and politicians are deliberately, hysterically amplifying the scale of this problem, that there are refugees everywhere, but they're not all headed for Britain, and the idea that is given that there's a huge army like Hitler's invasion force just waiting on the other side of the fence is completely fictional. What's your take on that?
Well, I think there is some truth in what you say, but I think the British government is also rightly concerned about what is effectively a huge problem nowadays. It's one of the biggest problems of our time, and it is migration. And it's also often linked with security issues. And that's the approach of the British government, I'm afraid. It's tying the two together, and that's what's creating the scaremongering behind stories that involve security and indeed movements of people. And the French coverage of the migrants issue has been pretty much the same, even though in France you actually have a nominally socialist government which is exceptionally reactionary when it comes to immigration issues. So I feel that the approach in both countries has been one of huge concern, because in the end we are dealing with up to 5,000 migrants in Calais. I have visited the camps myself, and there used to be a Sangat settlement before, a big center for refugees with all sorts of people involved in looking after the migrants from the health. There were charitable organizations available as well. Now it's all turned into a big, they call it the jungle, as it were, a big settlement, quite unruly as well, and where people are very vulnerable. Sangat was dismantled in 2002. That was welcomed by the British authorities because the idea was that it would make the place less attractive to migrants, but clearly this hasn't been the case.
5,000, though, is a very small number of people. We're talking about a country, Britain, where hundreds of thousands are immigrating here every year. The 5,000 is being painted as a multitude, and it isn't.
Yes, I mean, if you place that in the context of movements of people around the world, I mean, that has always been the case historically. People have always moved from their own country, especially when they live in devastated societies, and people are desperate to, start afresh, as it were, and they're looking for a place to go where they can be safe and prosper, as it were, in a new society.
As many hundreds of thousands British people did. Otherwise, Australia, Africa, Canada, the United States would still be populated by their original people. Maybe that would have been for the best. One point that is missed, of course, in both Britain, and I'd appreciate knowing if it's true in France, is that British and French wars in the very regions from which many of these migrants are coming have helped put these people on the move. And therefore, in a way, they're being double punished here. Their countries are being bombed, and then when they flee, they are somehow a dastardly enemy that has to be stopped at any cost over at the Calais border.
Well, it is true that the vast majority of people who are in Calais come from countries who have often been at the other end of Western bombing and have seen their societies destructed and an awful lot of loss of lives involved. And those who survived, want to get out. A country like Libya, for example, has been recently bombed into oblivion, and it's now a place where a lot of smugglers, people smugglers, are making an awful lot of money out of people's misery, putting people on makeshift boats who are desperate to leave.
Indeed, one of the people responsible for the destruction of Libya as a state is David Cameron himself. Yeah, he's one of the people blowing the bugle about all of this. Sorry, Gayatri, you were trying to get in.
Well, as it happens, last week I traveled through the tunnel twice. And ironically, the chaos was on the English side, not the French side, as they're suggesting. There were huge queues of trucks that were not able to move on because of the so-called chaos on the other side. But when I entered from Calais through to the tunnel, it went very smoothly.
Well, that's an interesting angle because, as I said in the introduction, the British media like to have a kick at France. But France is actually not responsible for this. It's the Eurotunnel company that is responsible for the perimeter through the holes in which some of these people who are trying to get on board trucks and so on are coming.
Well, I think one clearly shouldn't underestimate the efforts that the French authorities are putting into all this. The French Interior Minister has pledged to, invest more millions of euros to try to deal with this situation. They are clearly also involved in diplomacy with the British. There's a lot of meetings and talks going on. And there are also token gestures like the deployment of 120 extra police officers. It's a shared responsibility, in my view. But as you said, I think one shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in the end we are talking about people who should be in the prime of life but who are currently dying as they're desperately trying to make this hugely perilous journey across the Channel Tunnel. And the French authorities have actually blamed Eurotunnel for the loss of lives or for being a potentially lethal area for those migrants. So the absolute priority for both governments should be to focus on saving lives.
Now, the brouhaha around the Calais and tunnel stories has successfully diverted attention from the boat people, who are far more numerous, of course, and who I presume, though how could I know because the media isn't covering it, I presume are still leaving from the North African side of the Mediterranean and headed for Europe. Is that the case?
It is very much the case. There is pretty much every day several boats full of people who are trying to make it to the European shores. And I think the core issue in all this is that in the future we are likely to see more and more migrants coming from war-torn countries or the troubled parts of the world who want to make it into safe societies in Europe. And that's the problem that Europe will have to deal with and have to sort out. In spite of all its problems with Greece, for example, Europe is still a very stable trading bloc, which is very attractive and appealing to a lot of desperate people. Europe will have to come to find a solution. At the moment, it doesn't have a coordinated approach to this phenomenon, and it's far from finding a solution.
Well, I mean, I'll advance one. The first priority is to establish an orderly queue for scientifically appraised immigration. These people in the prime of life, showing such initiative, such determination to get here, are likely to be the very people that would act as an economic accelerator if they did get here. That's certainly been the immigrant story everywhere else in the world. No reason why this would be different. The second is to stop bombing their countries and interfering in their countries. Because if you go further south to the Horn of Africa, for example, the West has been involved in war and division in Ethiopia, Eritrea for as long as I've been alive. I've been conscious of it since the early 1960s. And the third would be to help economic development in the South by proper, fair trade and fair terms of investment so that their places became more attractive to stay in than setting out for Calais and trying to jump on the back of a train. How's that for a manifesto?
Well, I absolutely agree. I think there is undoubtedly a correlation between countries being bombed and indeed societies being destroyed and people therefore fleeing, devastated places effectively. There is no doubt about that. And there's also a misconception or prejudice about people fleeing those places to come and, somehow come and live on the benefit system. That couldn't be further from the truth. We are talking about people who have aspirations, who, like anybody else, want a decent life. They are often very hard-working people, and they simply want to start afresh. I fiercely opposed the bombing of Libya because it was dressed up as a humanitarian intervention, which eventually brought about regime change, which is, of course, against international law. But you would think that if the intention was indeed to bring about democracy, then why are not Western governments, and specifically the French and the British, who did most of the bombing, not involved now to build up civil society and indeed rebuild the country and make sure that it is, a fair and society to live in? Well,
they achieved the opposite. Thank you very much indeed, Nabila Ramdani, for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Is there light at the end of the tunnel? What now for those stranded in Calais? Norton Kane says Cameron and co. wage a war on these poor people's countries and then wage a war on them as refugees.
Well, it's absolutely true. And it's also a total failure of perspective. I myself had been persuaded that there was an army of 100,000 or so at Calais attempting to, in David Cameron's disgraceful words, swarm over here. Turns out there's 5,000. There's that many immigrants arriving, not just at Heathrow and Gatwick, but emigrating to Spain and Portugal from Britain.
Mm-hmm. That's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us, though, on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.